Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm Ziva Hassenfeld. I'm assistant professor here at the center and at Brandeis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our very special session today. Before we get to it, I just want to encourage everyone to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to learn about other upcoming events that we are hosting and to say that we are so delighted that so many of you are joining us live. But if you enjoy this conversation, as you will, and there are others who weren't able to make it, we will have a recording available. So please look out for that and feel free to share it with your friends, colleagues, and community. Today, we are so honored to welcome Dr. Tali Zelkowicz, who is the Director of Curriculum and Research at the Wexner Foundation. Among other accomplishments, she is an educator, rabbi, sociologist of education, and alumna of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship. She was also the founding coordinator of the Mandel Center Seniors Fellows Program, in which she also participated in an inaugural senior fellow. Her full bio will be dropped into the chat so you can learn more about her, as well as her incredible publication that we will be discussing today. Tali, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so looking forward to this conversation with you today.
Likewise, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And so today I want to discuss with you, and I just want to say that it was sort of hard to put down because there was so many interesting and really new ways of thinking about Jewish education in this piece, which is called Using Both and Thinking to Lead Transformative and Enduring Learning in Jewish Communal Life. And I want to ask you, because I found it such an original piece, to sort of just tell us a little bit about the core of your vision. How did you arrive at this piece?
So thank you for the question. The piece has been cooking in my mind and my heart really for over a decade because of the time that I've spent as a professional in day schools, in camp settings, in congregational schooling, and kind of crossing over these sort of liminal boundaries and seeing things from multiple points of view. And also, interestingly, at one point, when I was working with Dalit in Los Angeles, I was hiring academics and social workers to teach for me. And that became like this really crystallizing um, metaphor for a stark contrast between trying to help one group of people know that it wasn't just all about content, and the other group of people knowing it wasn't just all about following the learner's leads. And I just found myself as like this human loom trying to weave them together. And that kind of image and experience stuck with me for years. Fast forward to about 2 years ago when I was having what became a pretty pivotal conversation with a senior colleague who may be on this call and said to me, look, I really see two voices in this field right now. The voice that schreis Gewalt and worries, oh my gosh, Jews don't know anything anymore. And then there's this other group of voices that says, look, people don't even feel connected or whole or valued as Jews in belonging in their communities. And there are really no other voices, this person said, and they're not talking to each other very much. And I thought, is that true? And answering that question became this paper, really. What if the furniture in this room that we sort of accept as normal isn't making sense and is actually working against us?
Wow. And so as probably you have every piece of furniture on this call or will listen to this, what would it look like if the field responded to your call? How would Jewish education be different?
Oh boy, delicious. So I'm really have a vision of reviving what I think has been a vital tension for decades, I would even say centuries, and we could even go millennia with this one, actually. The vital tension is between what I call, and these are placeholders. I really treat these terms as placeholders locally in all of your communities. I hope people listening in and who read the paper will say, you know what, that word doesn't exactly work for me. It could be, and there are other terms, but for now, I've landed on transmission. In short, the process of preserving what we inherit with integrity, and translation, changing what we inherit into new languages or for new spaces, new times, and I would even add developmental stages. And I want to resist those two things being framed as a choice. I recently read a Jewish organization that asked, do we determine goals in advance or do we allow learners to do a self-exploration? And I want my vision, if it were successful and people started to sort of take it seriously, to answer that question with a paradoxical yes. And to resist even being forced into what I think is an artificial choice between those things, that we don't have to make a deliberate and highly intentional choice between those two things, for example. So I'll stop there.
Okay, that's really interesting. And again, as I said, there are so many poignant terms in this piece that assisted with my thinking. But I want to go right to one that you said just a few minutes ago, which is this formulation of Jews need to know stuff
Mhm.
versus Jews need to feel valued, or their whole selves need to feel valued. Um, and you spoke a little bit about that really interesting experience of hiring social workers and academics and that tension. But probably those are terms you came up with. They didn't say, "Hey, I care about Jews knowing stuff."
Correct. That is correct. And actually, in the field, instead of translation, the term typically used is transformation. And I've thought a lot about this and actually really wrestled with it. And I've personally prefer translation because I think the opposite of transformation, if you even I Googled it, is stagnation, stability, inertia. And I think it doesn't do, or the opposite of transformation, I should say, is stagnation, inertia. And that's not what we're talking about when we talk about transmission. Preservation is a very active process. And I think it's not fair so I understand and I'm totally fine with people using the word transformation, but I'm just explaining why I happen to land on translation in that process. And so transmission is kind of out there, more conventionally used, and translation was the term I came up with for kind of trying to capture this process of changing something that we inherit that into something meaningful for learners in a particular time, space, and developmental stage. And so it's in direct contrast, in opposition to transmission in that way. And that's the point. We have to be really true to both processes. And I think we need infinite commitment to preserving and holding on to that tension of those two. I actually brought a little um, um, prop. So I don't know if people can see this, but I have here a bolt and a nut. And this really is like the technology of transmission and translation, where on their own, in excess, if we only had infinite bolts or infinite nuts, we wouldn't be able to build a lot of stuff. We'd have like an excess of one technology or the other. But all of a sudden, when we put them together and we actually allow them to engage as a new third thing, which by the way, no one has a word for this, um, then we all of a sudden can create whole worlds. And there's an integrity to that, the tension of bringing both together, if that makes sense.
Right.
And
So
by the
I'm
way, that's not my metaphor. I love metaphors, but that actually came from Brian Emerson and Kelly Lewis in their book, Navigating Polarities.
So in a moment, I'm going to ask for a few examples of what it looks like when they come together, but I just want to step back. It's a little bit countercultural for you not to set up transmission as the bad guy, transmission as, what educators do when they're doing bad education. So tell me more about why do we need transmission? What do you mean when you say that it's not at all a passive process, that there's something really active in transmission.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, we could frame this tug of war debate that goes on in all sorts of asymmetrical and distorted ways. We could say, ugh, fluffy belonging versus rigorous knowing. We could say, stuffy past versus shiny, innovative present. We could also say exciting, fully engaging, attuned, engaging experiences versus irrelevant texts that are in foreign languages. We could frame all those things that way, and we wouldn't be doing justice to either transmission or translation. We'd be, treating either one of those in their kind of unhelpful, distorted, excessive, you know, with too much of either of those, you end up distorting the benefits of each. And so really, it's about, wait, remind me the original thread of your question.
Why is that? I said that you're rather countercultural in saying that transmission
uh,
is not sort of the bad guy.
right. That's interesting. I mean, I've heard both posed as the bad guys. It really depends on your autobiography, your personality, where you grew up, where you work, what you like. Um, uh, I'll answer your question with a vision of something that happened in Chicago a couple years ago. I was invited to teach this stuff, and I was very, very early stages of writing a draft of it, and I was presenting it as a workshop at the JUF in Chicago. Maybe some of you are even here right now. And this remarkable thing happened. Was the first time that I was kind of going live with these ideas, and I was in a room of Federation professionals, and we ended up with this kind of philosophical and even physical mechitza that I learned was running down the middle of the room where half the people there had the word engagement in their job description, in their titles, and the other half had the word education somewhere in their job titles. And they were like really sitting on different halves of the room. I can remember sitting there and going like this with them. And I had them do what is the original, like a little 2-minute kind of exercise that's at the beginning. You can link to it in the paper. And just to run down using their Kishka data only, just their gut first inclination, check down which items, and they're not labeled as transmission and translation in the exercise. It just says zig and zag. And at the end of 2 minutes, I said, okay, how many zigs and how many zags did everybody get? And it was uncanny. Half the room had ticked off all the zigs and half the room had ticked off all the zags, more or less. And I said, wow, what does this mean to you? Are you guys surprised? What does this mean? And they engaged in a conversation they said they've never had before about um, really feeling the people who were transmission leaning felt really burdened by having the responsibility to carry that torch. And those who were translation aimed felt very inadequate and insecure about the prospect of having to reach across that column and incorporate the others. And so um, I think that um, transmission takes prudence and translation takes chutzpah. And we really need an integrated flow of both forces. Um, Now I will answer your question directly. Transmission right now is taking a really bad rap because we happen to be in a thrust, a pendulum swing deep, deep, deep into translation, really since the Second World War, which was a reaction to 3 pendulum swings before that, since really the early 1900s. And so it's like this Jewish communal whiplash that we go through. And right now we're deep into translation. People are worried, for some good reasons, by the way, about mental health, wholeness, belonging, feeling heard, witnessed, connected, whole, like all of those things that we hear, books written about belonging and psychological safety. That's the world we're in right now. And so it seems like transmission is the enemy, but it's not, and it hasn't been. It depends on how we're integrating it into that nut bolt combination.
So give me a few examples of really powerful integrations that you've seen in your work.
Okay. So that one, I have to say, that one example that experienced in real time in Chicago, to me, has become this kind of fantasy in my head that that conversation could bubble up and surface and be facilitated across communities. That's one kind of proof of concept that, okay, this could be an interesting bridging conversation. But we also have the case studies that I used. There were four that I identified. There was one that I didn't talk about because I'm kind of implicated in it, but I'll mention it here now. Columbus Jewish Day School, where I was the head of school for several years, well before I got there, before I even knew about Columbus Jewish Day School, it had inherited and continued a DNA of profound integration and curricular integration, and had incredibly equally intense commitment to what I would call transmission and translation. And the reason why I think that they do and why the other case studies do too is because they don't treat either Judaism or learners as fragile. And I think if you begin to think of either as needing protection or as needing, extra buffering around it, you start to distort the balance. And especially, I will say here, even as a rabbi, Jewish studies is at risk, particularly for treating Jewish studies as fragile, and because of that, it tends to lean transmission. Not to mention survivalism and a concern about continuity, Jewish continuity. We want to hold on and preserve, and so we see that. But I think all of the case studies of visions of where this is working, where it's being integrated, have that one thing in common. Plus, they're all still, I would sadly say, they're pretty countercultural because of this pendulum swing we're in right now that towards translation. And I will say Jacob Citrin, who I'll give a shout out, I don't know if Jacob's on right now, and I quote him at length in the paper, has been really what he calls blog ranting about this since 2008, wherein he wrote this thing called Blowing Up Formal and Informal Education. And he says it's really countercultural. And it's really interesting because if you know Jacob, he works in camping. He's in Jewish camping, and his heart and soul and mind and everything are in Jewish camping. But he sees in camping this space and context for being able to integrate transmission and translation, my language, not his. So yeah, I would say in short, all the case studies, the ones that I know, and I'm sure the many that are out there, and I hope people who are listening are like doing mental diagnostics about, their own work, that it's about treating both our content and our learners as really durable.
And I'm gonna sort of ask for a few more details. How is Jacob Citron at Camp Ramah? How's he doing it? What are you seeing that looks like some sort of balance between,
Yeah.
is
So
it between
I'd
transmission
actually,
and translation? Does it happen in when they're eating, when they're praying, when they're singing, when they're swimming? Where's it happening?
yes, yes. Maybe not swimming, but I think it should. I actually haven't visited Ramah, Wisconsin, but I think, and I've actually stumbled upon, even though I know Jacob, I stumbled upon a piece he wrote for the Prisma's Hayedion periodical, where he wrote about this just a few years ago. And he really makes a case for the fact that we're all doing the same work. Like people shouldn't be hiring special professionals to do experiential learning at day schools. That we should be um, developing professionally our leaders to be able to think and develop habits of mind to do both. Um, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah.
A little bit?
I still want to push a little further for like give me like sort of just so that we have something to hold on to.
Uh,
And there are so many great examples in the piece itself, but like what does sort of give us a case study of all three of where it's purely transmission, where
mm,
it's purely translation, and then where there's some sort of integration.
yeah. So I think at camp, specifically like in Jacob's context and in camp in general, in my experience with camping, one of the pressure points is what sometimes gets called shiur, right? We have learning time that's carved out in the middle of an otherwise glorious day of fun, right? And it's this 1 hour or 45 minute, I don't know. And sometimes it's even like inside as opposed to rest, which is outside. It's maybe even with desks. And so all of a sudden we've like created this bifocal reality, almost like you have an hour of schooling amidst the rest of your immersive experience. And I think Jacob and others who are thinking about this at camps are blurring productively those boundaries without losing the commitment to clear goals and outcomes for learning across the flow of the day. So you ask for an example of like pure transmission. I don't know if there is like a pure example, but it's something like and by the way, don't let your mind go to a Beit Midrash. I think sometimes people lay on the ideological spectrum against this and transmission translation spectrum, and I think that's actually not fair or accurate. I think some of the Orthodox Jewish educators I know are among the most savvy translators. So that's just a cautionary note. So transmission is like, one person, sage on the stage, directly dictating content where the passive receivers are gathering content orally in those ways. However, even that, there are really great lectures. My dear teacher, David Ellenson, Zichrono Livracha, used to be able to compel an audience to tears with a lecture on intellectual history of Jewish, Orthodox halakha and stuff. And I've thought about it in this context, and I think it's because the way he was presenting the content and it was integrated he's a integrated human being, and there was application, relevance, and so it can even happen with covert participation. It doesn't have to be all overt. So it's not clear. So pure transmission is when we really forget about the learner. And David wasn't forgetting about the learner in the room, even as he was lecturing directly with frontal instruction. Pure translation, on the other hand, is I am all about these learners. I am going to follow wherever they go, what they need, and I'm going to just facilitate their process. And I'm going to celebrate everything that they need and want and understand in themselves, but to the exclusion of offering any kind of mirroring or engaging with their process, where the support has no challenge and no stretch. And you wonder at the end of the day, what's the value add? It may be a really wonderful, engaging, exciting experience, but at the end of the day, what has that person, what have those learners been equipped with to be able to do, feel, or know differently as a result of that experience?
And that was really, by the way, helpful. It really gave us something to hold on to. Just like I asked you about, and I know that at the beginning you said everyone should sort of sub in the words or terms that most resonate with them and their educational experience. But I'm interested in your words, and so you sort of talked us through transmission. Talk us through translation. How did you come to that word?
So I really, at first, just instinctively bristled against transformation, which is the word that's used in the field. And it's also the word sociologists have used to contrast against survivalism. And there's like a little bit of a Venn diagram here with the sociological work on survivalism and transformationism, which I've thought and written about actually a lot. And I wanted to kind of distinguish that because it didn't seem parallel to me. What's going on here with transmission and translation is not the same thing. It's part of it, but it's not the whole. So translation for me feels more creative. And here I will footnote and highlight and hyperlink my dear friend and colleague Miriam Heller-Stern's work. Like this is where you should like read her entire piece that she wrote for the Mandel Center on aspirations for the role of creativity in Jewish education. And that's really the intersect here. Translation is about being able to produce, innovate. This is the chutzpah part. Own, develop your sense of agency. And I felt like all of that was captured better by the concept, both metaphorically and literally, of translation than transformation, which felt like, oh, I'm just breaking what came before.
And so on the extreme of translation, what are they translating?
They're taking something they received and making it into something that makes sense to them. So a translator takes something from Spanish and translates it into English for English learners. There's always some loss for the English learner and there's always some gain because otherwise they would never have access to the Spanish original. So that act of translation is actually very creative, and I think too often, especially in rabbinical schools, it's considered like the chore before the dessert. You know, but to get to the juicy meaning of me getting to make new meaning in the chidush that Miriam writes so much about, the chidushim, I've got to do this like grudge work of translation. But I would love to actually reclaim that process because there's some really critical things that are happening, transformative things that are happening in the act of translation to get to the intellectual desserts.
Fabulous, fabulous. Um, and one piece, there's a part of this beautiful piece where you talk about, and I'm quoting you, countercultural efforts in the fields. Um, I want to ask you, what have you seen and what have you seen that's working really well?
So here I will flag the fourth of those efforts that I list in the paper is my dear colleague, and I accidentally happened upon her work. I wouldn't have known she was doing it, and that's actually right now how I'm finding all of these people, just sort of snowball sampling. Um, Michelle Shapiro Abraham, who works at Gather Inc., based in DC, called me and said, you know, I'm confused because as I'm leaving my work at the URJ, people are saying, I'm so sorry you're leaving education, as she was going to do engagement at Gather Inc. And she said, I heard you were writing about this and you know, what do I do? And I'm looking for ways of managing this. And I said, I think you're it. You're really paving the way for how to do this loom work of integrating it back and forth with each other. And so she's thinking, it's one of my favorite case studies of deep, deep work of that doesn't take the learners, that takes the learners very seriously and expects them to do hard work and is incredibly relational. And so there's this like immense intensity, I would say, in the samples of learning that she describes they do at Gather Inc. with their young adult learners of like not letting them off the hook of life choices that they make across the meanings of ideas, values, artifacts, practices, and also not treating them as objects at the end of a, you know, black box, where at the end we'll hopefully will actually save their Jewish identities and put them in, you know, the good category, not the bad category. That they're really subjects with identities, and no two are different, are the same, and being engaged, you know, it's a beautiful, I think it's called blending practice. That's her language of the blending. And she's had to do it on every level with her board, with her staff, with the people. They all have, you asked me about the enemy, what, you know, what gets cast as the bad guy. They all have different bad guys because of the baggage that we've grown up with.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That, my bad guy just sort of assumed was everyone's. It has
Right,
been
right.
so interesting to learn from you both in reading the piece, but also especially in hearing you talk about the piece.
So much.
I want to conclude, and I know we're almost out of time, but just with the question for all of us who are on this call feeling inspired, what's the next step in our own practice? What are the questions you want us asking ourselves?
Oh, I would love you to do the chart exercise with your people. Start there and see what it surfaces, and don't be afraid to engage in some kind of vulnerable peeling away of the layers of your investments, because what's wrong here is not that people have leanings. We really all have leanings. What gets problematic and limiting is when we don't own those leanings and say, oh, I'm deep into transmission or I'm deep into translation because, and now I need to listen and really dare to listen to the benefits of the other side and not worry that Judaism and Jewish life are going to be compromised because we draw from whatever the other is.
Fabulous. Tali, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure.
All of us on this call, and I know all of my students at Brandeis have been learning from you and your writing for many years now. So it's wonderful to add this piece to our collection. And I encourage everyone to go onto the Mandel website and download the piece, or we link to it, and reach out. Tali, I'm offering your time. Reach out to Tali if you read it and you have further questions.
Yes, please feel free to be in touch. We'll see what we can cook up together. It's been such an honor. Thank you, Ziva, for your time. And this conversation was really fun.
I agree. Thanks so much.